Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. What we're unpacking today is a story of just profound tragedy. It's about an agonizingly slow search for answers, and this absolutely wild, against all odds connection that finally brought everything into the light. The breadcrumbs left behind here, they are as chilling as they are crucial. We're looking at a case where everyday trust was literally weaponized. The justice system seriously faltered, but ultimately, forensic science had the final say. So, let's get into it.
So, picture this. How does a man murder two wives living 1,000 miles apart and just walk free for over a decade? Right? I mean, it sounds exactly like the plot of some dark Hollywood thriller, but this is a very real, very tragic piece of history. This killer somehow managed to exploit the deepest trust of two entirely different families, outmaneuver the legal system, and just vanish into normal life. But to really understand how this whole shebang unfolded, we actually need to drop right into the middle of the story at the exact moment two totally cold cases violently collided.
Section 1. The Conference Connection, 1,000 miles away.
All right, so set the scene. It's St. Petersburg, Florida, December 1997. We've got a retired police captain from New Hampshire, James Tucker, and he's sitting in this seminar at a cold case conference. Now, these conferences are basically where investigators from completely different jurisdictions get together to compare notes and share evidence, right? So Tucker is sitting there listening to a Florida investigator describe this unsolved 1990 murder down in Jacksonville. And as he's listening to the victimology and the sheer state of the crime scene, he's completely stopped in his tracks.
Tucker realized with an absolute jolt that every single detail, the method, the signature, it all perfectly matched an unsolved case he knew inside and out from up in New Hampshire 11 years earlier. The Florida cop was describing a young woman, dark hair, assaulted and strangled in her own apartment with zero signs of forced entry. But the detail that literally made Tucker's jaw drop? The killer had chopped off clumps of the victim's dark hair and just scattered them around the home, leaving this huge pile right near the bathtub. That is a deeply chilling, highly specific detail, way too specific to just be a random coincidence.
Section 2. Parallel tragedies. Two victims, one pattern.
Let's look at these cases side by side. First, we have Michelle LaFond in New Hampshire, back in 1987. She was 23 years old, 4 months pregnant. Dark hair cut and left at the scene, no forced entry. Then you look at Dina Kittler in Florida, 1990. 21 years old, mother to a 2-year-old. Dark hair cut and left at the scene, no forced entry. See the pattern, right? Both were young mothers, or about to be. Both had dark hair, both were attacked in the perceived safety of their own homes. In fact, investigators later noted that if you put their photos next to each other, Michelle and Dina honestly looked like sisters.
Let's break down this killer's incredibly calculating, predatory method. Step 1, he befriends the husband. Step 2, he uses that friendship to get inside, learning the layout and gaining familiarity with the home. Step 3, he just waits. He waits for the husband to be away at work or deployed. And step 4, he attacks the unprotected victim when he knows for a fact she's entirely alone. It's terrifying because he essentially weaponized the very concept of community trust.
Section 3. Tragedy in New Hampshire, March 4th, 1987.
Okay, going back to the very beginning. The date is March 4th, 1987. The place is Dublin, New Hampshire. Now, this was a really small rural town, maybe 2,000 people tops. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and people routinely just left their doors unlocked. So Gary LaFond, Michelle's husband, comes home from his job at a local factory. And he walks into a home that has just been completely torn apart by a violent struggle. He found his 23-year-old wife, Michelle, in the upstairs bathroom. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled with an electrical cord. And she was 4 months pregnant with their first child. The killer didn't just take one life that day. He took 2.
11 years. Just let that sit for a second. For 11 excruciating years, Michelle's family, especially her mother, Maxine, just had to wait for answers. Now, the DNA recovered from the crime scene, specifically an unknown male profile, was carefully preserved by investigators. But you have to remember, back in 1987, forensic technology was super limited. There wasn't some massive national database you could just run a search through, so that crucial evidence just sat completely useless in a storage locker while a killer walked free.
Section 4. Moving south. A new start in Florida.
So after all this, the killer, a man named John Edward Brewer, packs up and moves to Florida. He gets a job as a painter over at the Mayport Naval Station. And once again, he inserts himself right into the life of a local family, a Navy officer named Pat Kittler and his wife Dina. Brewer hung out at their apartment.
He literally babysat their 2-year-old son, and he totally earned their trust. And right before Pat was deployed overseas on the USS Forrestal, Brewer actually made him a promise. He looked Pat in the eye and promised he would look after Dina while he was away at sea. And the very next night, Brewer knocked on Dina's door, and because she knew him, she let him in.
1,000 miles. That is the geographical distance between Dublin, New Hampshire and Jacksonville, Florida. And honestly, this massive distance acted like a natural shield for him. Without a centralized, computerized database in the late 80s and early 90s, local police departments just had absolutely no way of knowing what was going on across the country. They were basically operating in the dark.
Section 5. When the system fails. Slipping through the cracks.
Which brings us to something known as the alibi loophole. See, when Florida police first investigated Dana's murder, they actually found an address book that led them straight to Brewer. He had fresh cuts on his hands, and he even smoked the exact same brand of cigarette that was found snuffed out in blood at the crime scene. But here's the catch. Brewer openly admitted to the police that he had been in Dana's apartment prior to the murder, claiming he just wanted to look at some floor plans. And because he freely admitted to this prior innocent presence, his defense was able to argue that any hairs or physical evidence he left behind were just from that earlier visit, not the actual murder. So in 1993, a judge ruled there simply wasn't enough evidence to hold him. He basically had plausible deniability.
Let's just walk through this timeline of systemic failures because it's absolutely maddening. In 1987, Brewer was actually interviewed in New Hampshire as part of the initial investigation, but they kind of just ignored him. 6 days later, he's sent to prison on a totally unrelated parole violation, effectively dodging local scrutiny. Fast forward to 1991, he gets arrested for Dina's murder down in Florida. By 1993, he gets released by a judge because of that alibi loophole we just talked about. And by 1994, the charges are completely dropped. The justice system had this guy in its grasp multiple times, yet he slipped right through the cracks and went completely free in the community.
Section 6. Connecting the DNA. Science catches up.
So let's map out this agonizingly slow journey to justice. We have the New Hampshire murder in 87, then the Florida murder in 90. Then we see the failed arrest in 91 and his release in 93. But then, finally, we hit 1997, that pivotal cold case conference. Once Captain Tucker connected the incredibly specific signatures of these two cases, investigators from Florida and New Hampshire immediately teamed up. They were finally able to compare the semen DNA that had been preserved from Michelle's 1987 crime scene with the hair follicles found at Dina's 1990 crime scene. And guess what? It was a perfect match.
Now, when investigators started digging into Brewer's files in Florida, they found an old job application. And on it, John Edward Brewer had actually listed Gary LaFond, the husband of his very first victim, Michelle, as a personal reference. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The man who violently murdered Michelle had manipulated her family so deeply, so completely, that her grieving husband had literally vouched for him on paper. It's just sickening.
Section 7. Delayed justice for 2. Closure for the families.
Finally, in April 1998, armed with this totally undeniable DNA match linking the two states, police moved in and arrested Brewer. Now facing first-degree murder charges and the very real threat of the electric chair in Florida, Brewer finally caved. He confessed to both murders, giving up specific details that honestly only the killer could have known. By the summer of 1999, he pleaded guilty in both states. His cold calculation to save his own life did at least spare the families the unimaginable trauma of a public trial. Ultimately, he was handed consecutive life sentences with absolutely no possibility of parole.
Throughout this entire tragic ordeal, there is one really devastating reality that stands out. Both husbands called him a friend. Gary LaFond worked right alongside Brewer at a factory. Pat Kittler invited him into his home, literally trusting him to watch over his family while he served his country. The most devastating realization for these two men was that the monster who violently destroyed their lives wasn't some random stranger lurking in the bushes. No, it was someone they had warmly welcomed through their own front doors.
Which leads us to a final, pretty chilling thought to take away from all this. We all leave our families with people we trust, right? But how well do we really know them? It's the kind of question that definitely lingers long after the facts of this case are laid out. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. Keep asking those tough questions, and I will see you next time.